In today's video, I'm going to tell you the detailed story of Keiko, a Japanese military nurse captured during World War II who expected torture and death, but found something completely different. When she stepped into an American prison camp, what she saw left her speechless. Clean beds, warm food, and unexpected humanity. This shocking true story reveals how compassion inside enemy walls changed everything these women believed about war and about America. The final days, September 1945. The war had ended, but for Keiko and dozens of other Japanese women serving in military hospitals across the Pacific Islands, the nightmare was just beginning. They had spent years tending to wounded soldiers in caves and makeshift bunkers, watching boys die from infections they couldn't treat, holding hands that grew cold in the tropical heat. Now, as American forces swept through the islands, these women faced a choice they had prepared for since their first day of service. Their commanding officers had been clear. Capture meant dishonor worse than death. American soldiers would show no mercy to Japanese women. The propaganda films had shown them everything. Women assaulted, families destroyed, bodies left in ditches like discarded refuse. Keiko kept a small vial hidden in her uniform pocket. Cyanide, stolen from the medical supplies. She wasn't alone. Nearly every woman in her unit had secured some method of escape. Sharpened bamboo, hoarded pills, even lengths of rope carefully concealed. They had practiced in whispers, encouraging each other to be brave when the moment came. The morning the Americans arrived, Keiko and 32 other women knelt in the dirt outside their hospital compound. The building behind them still smelled of blood and disinfectant, though most of the patients had already been evacuated or died. The sun beat down mercilessly as they waited, heads bowed, fingers trembling. Keiko could hear her own heartbeat. She thought of her mother back in Osaka, wondered if the city still stood, if anyone would ever know what happened to her daughter on this forgotten island. She pressed her hand against the vial in her pocket, feeling its weight, its promise of a quick end. The sound of engines grew louder. Dust rose in clouds as military trucks rolled to a stop. Boots hit the ground with heavy thuds. This was it. Keiko closed her eyes and began to pray. The impossible moment. But the gunfire never came. Instead, Keiko heard something that made no sense. English words, spoken not in anger, but in what sounded like concern. She dared not lift her head, certain it was a trap. Around her, other women began to shake uncontrollably. One collapsed entirely, hyperventilating in the dust. Then hands touched her shoulders, not rough or violent, but gentle. Keiko flinched as if struck, but the hands simply helped her to her feet. She opened her eyes to see an American soldier, barely older than her younger brother, gesturing for her to stand. His face showed no hatred, only a kind of tired professionalism. A woman appeared, an American nurse in a crisp uniform, her blonde hair pulled back, her blue eyes scanning the group with practiced efficiency. She began speaking in broken Japanese, her accent thick, but her intent clear. No one would be hurt. They were prisoners, yes, but they would be treated according to international law. Keiko didn't believe her. Couldn't believe her. This had to be some elaborate cruelty, a false hope before the inevitable violence. She searched the American faces for signs of deception, for the masks to drop and reveal the demons underneath. Instead, the American nurse stepped forward and did something that would haunt Keiko for the rest of her life. She smiled, opened her arms, and embraced the nearest Japanese woman, a young auxiliary named Hana who had been sobbing since the trucks arrived. Hana went rigid. Her eyes widened in absolute shock. The American nurse held her for just a moment, patting her back gently, then released her and moved to the next woman. And the next. Each embrace was brief but unmistakable, a gesture of comfort, not conquest. When the nurse reached Keiko, she found herself frozen, unable to move or speak. The American woman's arms wrapped around her, warm and solid, and Keiko felt something break inside her chest. Not fear, something deeper. The certainty that had sustained her through years of war, the absolute conviction that these people were monsters, cracked like thin ice under weight. The nurse pulled back, looked Keiko in the eye, and said something in English. Another nurse translated. She says you're safe now. She says you did your duty, and now it's over. Keiko's legs gave out. She sank back to her knees, not in submission, but in shock. Around her, other women were weeping, not from terror, but from confusion so profound it felt like drowning. The first night, they were loaded onto trucks, but not roughly. Soldiers helped them climb up, steadied those who stumbled, handed canteens of water to women whose lips were cracked from dehydration. Keiko sat in the truck bed, watching the jungle recede, her mind unable to process what was happening. The camp they arrived at looked nothing like the hellscape she had imagined. Canvas tents stood in neat rows, generators hummed steadily, and electric lights blazed against the gathering dusk. She could smell food cooking, real food, not the thin rice gruel they had survived on for months. Inside a large tent, they were directed to sit on wooden benches. Medical supplies lined the walls. Real supplies, not the empty bottles and broken instruments they had worked with. Glass vials gleamed under electric lamps. Bandages stacked higher than seemed possible. Machines Keiko didn't recognize but knew must be valuable. An American doctor entered, flanked by nurses. Through an interpreter, he explained they would each be examined for injuries and illness. Any infections would be treated, any pain would be addressed. They would receive clean clothes, hot food, and a place to sleep. Keiko wanted to scream at them to stop lying, to end the charade and reveal their true intentions. But the examination proceeded with clinical professionalism. The doctor checked her for malnutrition, noted the infected cut on her arm, and injected something he called penicillin. Within hours, the burning pain that had plagued her for weeks began to ease. That night, lying on a clean cot with a full stomach for the first time in a year, Keiko stared at the canvas ceiling and tried to reconcile reality with everything she had been taught. The food had been abundant, casually so. Beef stew with actual chunks of meat, bread that was soft and white, coffee sweetened with real sugar. The Americans had eaten first, clearly demonstrating it wasn't poisoned, then handed out portions that would have fed an entire Japanese ward. The woman in the cot next to her, a radio operator named Michiko, whispered in the darkness, "They're fattening us up before they kill us. This is psychological torture." But Keiko wasn't sure anymore. The uncertainty itself was terrifying. The unraveling. Days turned into weeks, and the promised violence never materialized. Instead, routines emerged. Morning meals, medical checkups, work details that involved sorting supplies or helping in the camp kitchens. The Americans weren't cruel taskmasters. They showed the women how to operate equipment, gave breaks in the heat, and treated mistakes with patience rather than punishment. The most devastating moments came in small observations. An American guard tossing half a chocolate bar into the trash, more food wasted in that single gesture than Keiko's family had seen in months. A broken radio simply replaced instead of painstakingly repaired, soap handed out as if it cost nothing. Keiko had been told America was starving, that their supply lines were broken, that victory was only a matter of time before the bloated empire collapsed under its own weakness. Yet here, on a tiny island thousands of miles from their homeland, the Americans had built a functioning camp with electricity, running water, and food in such abundance that prisoners ate better than Japanese soldiers had. The propaganda had been lies. All of it. The question that haunted Keiko wasn't whether Japan had lost the war. It was whether Japan had ever had a chance of winning. Letters from the enemy. One afternoon, a young American nurse named Margaret approached Keiko with a cardboard box. Inside were letters and small packages, donations from American families who had heard about the Japanese prisoners. Margaret explained through the interpreter that civilians back home wanted to help. Keiko stared at the box as if it contained snakes. Why would American families, whose sons had died fighting Japan, send gifts to enemy prisoners? It made no sense. It violated everything she understood about war, about human nature, about revenge. Margaret pulled out a knitted scarf, clearly handmade, with a note pinned to it. The interpreter read aloud, "To a Japanese woman far from home, I hope this keeps you warm. My son fought in the Pacific, but I believe we are all mothers together. May you see your family again soon." The son had fought in the Pacific, might have died there. And still, his mother had knitted a scarf for an enemy prisoner. Keiko took the scarf with shaking hands. The wool was soft, dyed a gentle blue, and still smelled faintly of the soap used to wash it. She pressed it against her face and wept. Not from sadness, but from the shattering of every certainty she had built her life upon. Other women received similar packages: candy for those with children back home, pencils and paper, photographs of American families smiling in front of houses that looked untouched by war, gardens bursting with vegetables, children playing in streets free from rubble. Margaret encouraged them to write back if they wished. Some refused, clinging to the remnants of pride. But others, Keiko among them, began to compose careful letters. "Thank you for the scarf. Thank you for thinking of us. I hope your son came home safely." When replies arrived months later, the psychological walls collapsed entirely. American families wrote back with warmth, with curiosity, with forgiveness that seemed incomprehensible. They asked about Japanese culture, about daily life before the war, about hopes for the future. They wrote as if these women were human beings worthy of conversation, not defeated enemies to be despised. The embrace of understanding. The American nurses became the most powerful agents of transformation. They worked alongside the Japanese women in the medical tents, showing them techniques and treatments that seemed like miracles. Penicillin that cured infections within days. Blood transfusions performed with precision. Surgical procedures that left clean scars instead of jagged wounds. Margaret took a particular interest in Keiko, perhaps sensing her internal struggle. She brought English primers, teaching basic words and phrases during quiet moments. She showed Keiko American magazines, pointed out pictures of everyday life back home. Supermarkets stocked with food, schools filled with healthy children, factories humming with production. One day, Margaret asked through the interpreter about Keiko's family. Keiko described her mother, her younger siblings, the small house in Osaka that probably no longer stood. Margaret listened intently, then pulled out her own photographs. Her husband in uniform, her 2 daughters back in Nebraska, her parents on their farm. "We're not so different," Margaret said simply. "We all just want our families safe." It was perhaps the most dangerous statement Keiko had ever heard, because it was true. And if it was true, then the entire foundation of the war, the entire narrative of Japanese superiority and American barbarism, collapsed into dust. The embraces continued, but they changed in meaning. At first, they had been shocking violations of everything Keiko expected. Now, they became something else. Acts of connection, recognition of shared humanity. When Margaret hugged her goodbye at the end of a long shift, Keiko found herself hugging back, feeling the warmth of another human being who had chosen kindness over cruelty. The long journey home. Repatriation came in early 1947. The war had been over for more than a year, but the logistics of returning millions of displaced people took time. When Keiko and her fellow prisoners boarded the ship bound for Japan, they were hardly recognizable as the terrified women who had knelt in the dust expecting death. They wore clean clothes. Their bodies had healed. But more profoundly, their minds had been transformed. They had seen abundance where they were promised scarcity. They had received mercy where they expected brutality. They had been treated as human beings by an enemy that was supposed to be inhuman. The voyage was long and quiet. Women clustered on deck, watching the endless ocean, speaking in hushed tones about what awaited them. Japan was in ruins. Cities burned, families scattered, the emperor reduced from god to mortal. What place would there be for women who had seen too much, who knew too many truths? Keiko spent hours staring at the horizon. The blue scarf Margaret had given her wrapped around her shoulders despite the warm weather. She thought about the vial of cyanide she had carried, how close she had come to using it, how different her life would have been if she had succeeded. She thought about the moment Margaret first embraced her, how foreign and terrifying it had felt, and how, by the end, those embraces had become the most honest thing she had experienced in years of war. Seeds of a New Japan. When they arrived in Yokohama, the devastation was worse than imagined. The port city was a landscape of ash and broken concrete. People moved like ghosts through rubble, thin,